1851, Charleston, South Carolina. They said every man's worth could be measured in silver, but that morning, a human life was sold for 17 cents. What kind of world weighs a woman's body by the tarnish on a coin? Before we continue, please subscribe so you never miss these haunting untold stories. The auction yard was a carnival of cruelty, men in coats laughing over misery, the sharp scent of sweat, hay, and cheap tobacco filling the morning air. The wooden stage creaked beneath the weight of shackled souls. Beside a tall post, a woman stood trembling, her wrists bound, her swollen belly betraying what her captors tried to hide. Her name was Clara, and the child she carried belonged not to the man selling her, but to the one who had once whispered false promises into her ear under the cover of moonlight. The auctioneer's voice boomed like a preacher's sermon. 17 cents. Going once. The crowd erupted in snickers. A man stepped forward, a stranger with gray eyes that gleamed like winter steel. His name was Master Eli Thornwell, a plantation owner known not for kindness, but for a peculiar hunger for control. He tossed a single coin, caught it, and let it clatter against the auction block. Sold, the auctioneer declared, and the sound of the hammer echoed like a death knell. When Clara was led to Thornwell's carriage, she lifted her eyes only once. Behind the smoke and the faces, she saw the overseer, the one who had once owned her, the child's true father. He looked away, ashamed, as if hoping that by not meeting her gaze, he could erase what he'd done. That night, the Thornwell estate stood against the horizon like a dark crown. Its windows glowed faintly through the mist, but no warmth lived there. Inside, the walls whispered with secrets. Thornwell's wife, Margaret, watched from the grand staircase as Clara was brought in. Margaret's beauty had faded under the weight of loveless years. When her eyes fell on Clara, her expression was not pity, it was envy. "Another mouth to feed?" she asked coldly. "She'll work for her place," Thornwell replied. "And when she's done, maybe she'll remember who owns her." But what Thornwell didn't know, what no one could have known, was that Clara's silence was not submission. The 17-cent woman was not as helpless as she appeared. The fire that had been stolen from her was rekindling, slow and quiet, beneath the ashes of humiliation. As days passed, Clara was assigned to the nursery, irony cruel and sharp, for she herself was nearing childbirth. Margaret would visit, her perfume suffocating, her words dripping with scorn. "You think because you carry a man's child you matter? You're a vessel, nothing more." But in Margaret's tone was something deeper, an insecurity that twisted with every glance at Clara's youth, her resilience, her refusal to break. Weeks turned to months. Clara gave birth in a small, dim corner of the servants' quarters, with no doctor, no prayers, only the midwife's trembling hands and her own will to survive. The child's first cry split the silence of the Thornwell estate like lightning. And though the air was heavy with pain, Clara's heart surged with something new, purpose. She looked down at the newborn, whose skin carried both histories, both sins, the pale trace of one man's cruelty, and the dark strength of her mother's defiance. She whispered, "You won't grow in chains." Eli Thornwell watched from the doorway, curiosity flickering across his face. "That child," he muttered, "it's lighter than I expected." Margaret turned sharply. "Whose is it?" Thornwell smiled faintly. "Does it matter?" That night rain lashed the windows. In the nursery, Margaret stared at the cradle that once held her stillborn son. She had never forgiven God for taking him. But now she saw the new baby, the child of another man, sleeping where hers never had. Something broke inside her. She stood over the cradle, fingers tightening on the silk edge. "You don't belong here," she whispered. But before she could act, Clara appeared in the doorway, her voice calm, eyes burning with something unearthly. "Touch my child," she said, "and you'll never sleep again." For a moment, the house was silent. Only the wind outside answered. Margaret stepped back, shaken, not by Clara's words, but by the strange stillness that followed them, as though the walls themselves had heard a promise that would not be broken. In the following weeks, Thornwell noticed something unsettling. Servants whispered that mirrors in the house were fogging with handprints when no one was near. A white feather was found in his study, resting on his account book, the page marked with the number 17. The same number he had tossed at the auction. By the end of that month, one of the overseers vanished without a trace, the same man who had once owned Clara. His horse was found days later by the river, reins snapped, saddle soaked in blood. When Margaret asked Thornwell if he feared revenge, he laughed. "A slave's anger is noise, nothing more." But that night as he passed the nursery, he saw something that froze his breath. Clara was standing by the cradle, her child asleep, her hand tracing invisible patterns in the air. For a moment, it looked as though the candlelight bent toward her, as if drawn by some unseen current. 17 cents, she murmured almost to herself. That's what my soul was worth to you. Thornwell stepped closer. And what do you think it's worth now? Clara turned her eyes to him, steady, unflinching. Enough to buy your ruin. He laughed then, but it was the kind of laugh that trembles, that knows deep down it has already heard its own echo from the grave. And as the storm howled over the Carolina marshlands, the Thornwell estate creaked and whispered, as if every beam remembered the price that had been paid, and the one that was still to come. By the spring of 1852, the Thornwell estate had grown unnaturally quiet. What once echoed with the laughter of guests and the rhythmic sound of boots on marble had turned into a house of whispers. Servants crossed themselves when they passed the nursery. Doors seemed to close by themselves. At night, the faint lullaby of a woman's voice could be heard from the east wing, soft, mournful, and not entirely human. Master Eli Thornwell dismissed the talk as nonsense. A draft, he said. And the sound of weak minds. But the weight in the air was undeniable. Even the horses refused to approach the back stables after dark. Margaret Thornwell, once sharp and regal, had grown pale and sleepless. Her eyes carried a shadow that even daylight couldn't erase. She had not spoken to Clara since that night by the cradle, yet she often found herself waking with the name Clara on her tongue. One morning, as the fog lifted from the fields, Margaret wandered into the servants' quarters. The smell of milk, ash, and herbs hung thick in the air. Inside she saw Clara sitting by her child, rocking slowly, humming that same song. "You think you've frightened me," Margaret said coldly. "You think your defiance makes you powerful." Clara didn't look up. "Power doesn't come from fear," she said quietly. "It comes from knowing who you are." Margaret's lip curled. "You are property." Clara finally raised her eyes, and in them was something ancient, something Margaret could not name. "Property does not stare back," Clara whispered. "But I do." That night, Margaret dreamt of the nursery filled with water. The cradle floated, overturned, and a pale hand reached out from beneath the ripples. When she woke, her pillow was damp, her nightgown torn at the shoulder. At breakfast, Thornwell was distracted. He'd been receiving letters from neighboring estates, rumors of insurrections, of slaves poisoning livestock, of strange markings burned into barns. "They say it's the women leading them," he muttered. "Preachers in skirts. Witches." Margaret smiled bitterly. "Then you've made a fine home for one." The words lingered between them, sharp as glass. Later that day, Thornwell summoned Clara to his study. The room smelled of old paper and lamp oil. "I hear talk," he said, pacing. "You've been meeting with the field hands after dark. What business do you have stirring unrest?" "I teach them to read," Clara answered calmly. Thornwell stopped mid-step. "To read?" "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "The Bible. Your wife gave me a copy when she still believed in mercy." His expression hardened. "You forget your place." Clara smiled faintly. "No, master. I remember it better than anyone." That night, Thornwell locked the study door and poured himself whiskey. He thought of the letter he'd received that morning, of a neighboring planter found dead, his face twisted, mouth filled with ash. Scrawled on the wall beside him had been a single word, "Paid." He tried to laugh it off, but his hand shook as he reached for his glass. A faint sound drew his attention, a creak from the floorboards, a whisper of cloth. He turned toward the mirror, and for a split second, he saw her reflection standing behind him, holding the child. He spun around, but the room was empty. The next morning, the overseer's widow arrived, pale and trembling. "They found him," she said, her voice cracking. "Down by the river." His mouth was full of dirt. His eyes open. Thornwell's jaw clenched. "And what of it?" "They say she cursed him," the woman whispered. "The slave woman. Clara." That evening, Thornwell confronted her. "What did you do?" he demanded. Clara looked up from her sewing, her child asleep in the corner. "Nothing you didn't start." He struck her once hard enough to draw blood. She didn't cry out. Instead, she looked him in the eye and said, "You've mistaken silence for weakness, master. But silence is how storms begin." That night, lightning struck the Thornwell fields. The cotton burned blue-white under the rainless sky. Servants said they saw figures walking through the smoke, hands glowing faintly, singing low hymns. Margaret stood by her window, staring out at the flames. "What have you done to this house?" she whispered. In the darkness behind her, Clara's voice answered softly, "Only what it asked me to." For the first time, Margaret turned and saw her, Not as a servant, not as a slave, but as something far larger. The air around Clara seemed to hum, the candlelight bending toward her like it did the night she made her vow. And as the fire devoured the fields, the Thornwell legacy began to crumble, one ember at a time. By dawn, the Thornwell plantation was reduced to a smoldering skeleton. Columns cracked and split in the heat, beams fell like collapsing prayers, and what remained of the cotton fields hissed with smoke that carried the scent of charred empire. The sky was still bruised with lightning, as though the storm refused to leave until it had finished what it began. In the ruins of the East Wing, Clara stood barefoot, her child pressed against her chest, both untouched by the blaze. The servants gathered behind her in stunned silence, their faces lit by the dying glow. For the first time they weren't looking down, they were looking at her. Margaret Thornwell stumbled through the courtyard in a torn nightgown, her hair wild, soot clinging to her skin. "You've doomed us all," she gasped. "You've killed everything he built." Clara turned slowly. "He built a house on bones, mistress. It was already dying." Behind her, a man stepped forward, Samuel, one of the field hands carrying a burned Bible. "We found this," he said quietly, handing it to her. The pages were singed, but one verse remained untouched. Vengeance is mine, I will repay. Clara's eyes lingered on it. Then let him see what vengeance looks like when the meek have learned fire. Hours later, Thornwell was found alive but broken. His right arm burned, his face blackened, his voice reduced to a rasp. He had crawled from the wreckage, leaving a trail of blood through the ash. When they carried him inside what was left of the great hall, he saw Clara standing near the hearth, calm, unburned, her child asleep in her arms. "Finish it," he croaked. "If you've come to kill me, finish it." Clara looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "I've already finished it," she said. "You just don't understand the shape of your ending yet." That night, word spread across the neighboring counties. They said the Thornwell estate was cursed. Horses refused to ride near it. Travelers saw a woman standing in the ruins, her dress glowing faintly as if lit from within. But Clara was gone. Margaret, driven near to madness, searched every burned room, every clearing, calling her name into the fog. "You wanted freedom?" she cried. "Is this what it looks like?" There was no answer, only the creak of scorched timber and the slow drip of rain through broken ceilings. Weeks passed. The plantation was abandoned. The slaves, what few remained, had fled under the cover of smoke and silence. The Thornwell name became a curse whispered in taverns, a warning carved into wooden doors: "Don't build your house on ghosts." In the summer of 1853, a traveler from New Orleans claimed to have seen her, Clara, in a churchyard outside Baton Rouge. She was dressed in white, her child older now, her hands folded as she watched a funeral procession pass. When asked who had died, she said softly, "A man who once thought he owned me." Then she turned and disappeared into the rain. Margaret never recovered. She spent her remaining years confined to a small room in Charleston, muttering about smoke, lullabies, and a mirror that refused to show her reflection. On the last night of her life, the nurse swore she heard her whisper, "I can still hear her singing." The Thornwell estate never rose again. Wild grass consumed the ruins. Locals claimed the soil was cursed. Nothing grew where the great house once stood. But when the wind blew just right, they said you could still hear the faint hum of a woman's voice in the distance, singing to a child who never cried. And perhaps, if vengeance has a sound, it isn't fire or thunder, but the quiet lullaby of a woman who learned that sometimes, justice doesn't come from gods or masters. It comes from those who were never meant to speak at all. By the winter of 1854, the story of Thornwell Plantation had already drifted into myth. Preachers in Louisiana warned their flocks that the wrath of God had visited the wicked. Storytellers around campfires turned Clara into a phantom saint, the Black Madonna of the fire. To the freedmen who whispered her name, she was not a ghost but a prophecy, proof that the earth itself could rise up and devour its masters. In Charleston, the surviving Thornwells had become relics of disgrace. The family fortune was gone, their social standing buried beneath gossip and ruin. Margaret Thornwell, now pale as parchment, was last seen wandering St. Philip's graveyard in the rain, her shawl dragging through mud and moss. She carried with her a silver locket, inside it, a lock of hair that had turned to ash. One night, a candle in her room flickered wildly before going out. The nurse found her the next morning, sitting upright in her chair, eyes open and fixed toward the window. A thin smile rested on her lips, and her hand was clutching that burned locket. The coroner wrote, "Natural causes." But those who knew her whispered she'd seen the fire again. Far from Charleston, Clara had found refuge in New Orleans. She worked quietly in a laundress's quarters behind a small chapel, her child now walking beside her, clutching her skirt. She no longer spoke of the plantation or the fire, though sometimes, on the hottest days, she'd glance at the smoke rising from ships in the harbor and her eyes would cloud with something between grief and victory. An old priest once asked her name. "Clara Thornwell," she said softly. He blinked. "You carry their name?" "I carry what's mine," she replied. Rumor said she took the Thornwell boy to school, taught him to read, and told him stories of freedom instead of fear. He never knew the truth of his blood, but every night before sleeping, he would ask her to sing the lullaby, the same one she sang in the burning house. Years later, when that boy grew into a man and joined the Union cause, he would write in a letter to his fiancée, "My mother once told me that every man builds a fire, some to warm, some to destroy. The only question is who you stand beside when it burns." And somewhere deep in the Louisiana marsh, where the reeds shiver like old ghosts, travelers still find traces of the Thornwell estate: charred brick, melted iron, a cross of rusted nails bound together by roots. On some nights, they say, you can hear a woman's voice humming beneath the crickets. Others swear the fog itself glows faintly, shaped like a mother cradling her child. No one knows if Clara lived to see freedom become law. Some say she sailed north, following the river until she vanished into the New World. Others believe she remained in the South, quietly watching the land that once owned her crumble into dust. But every historian who touched the Thornwell records agreed on one thing. Her name appeared again one final time in a birth ledger from 1865. Next to her child's name was written a single note in faded ink: "Born of fire. Free." And so, the story ends where it began, not with chains but with smoke rising toward the morning sky. Before you go, if this haunting tale of justice and ashes moved you, remember to like this video. Your support keeps these forgotten voices alive. The past may be buried, but as long as we tell their stories, the fire will never die.